It began before dawn on October 29, 2025, when a Ukrainian electronic intelligence node near Pokrovsk pinged a pattern that didn't match any routine Russian movement. At first, it looked like a standard artillery supply run, a ribbon of heavy-tracked vehicles rolling slowly down the H-20 highway. But analysts watching the drone traffic noticed the tracer, dozens of small quadcopters hovering like gnats above the column, feeding live telemetry into a distributed control network. Within hours, the Ukrainians had mapped a 12-kilometer kill box around the road and waited for the moment the tanks would make their classic mistake, gathering into a tight, fuel-laden column while resupplying. What followed would be presented months later in briefings as a textbook of modern anti-armor warfare, a demonstration of how cheap unmanned systems and surgical intelligence can turn steel giants into burning carcasses. The operation's codename was Iron Wasp. It relied on three things: persistent drone surveillance, low observable loitering munitions, and a financial ledger tracked in open-source footprints that tied a single mechanized formation to a specific Russian brigade's logistics cycle. Ukraine's drone arsenal had been quietly maturing all year. By October, Ukrainian forces were launching long-range strikes that reached deep inside Russian territory and were credited with hitting fuel depots, refineries, and logistics hubs. Operations reported across multiple outlets in late 2025 as a growing campaign of long-range drone attacks. On the morning the ambush was sprung, a lead swarm of reconnaissance quadcopters descended to map the column. Ranges between hulls, exposed engine bays, turret orientations, inter-vehicle spacing. They tagged weak points, open hatches, external fuel drums, tow cables, then fed that geometry to a second wave. Kamikaze drones packed with shaped charges and thermite payloads, and small glide bombs repurposed from commercial airframes. The glide munitions struck the lead T-80 and the accompanying logistics truck within 30 seconds of each other. The truck's fuel caught instantly and turned the asphalt into a rolling inferno. The tank crews, conditioned to expect artillery, froze at the wrong time. With fuel and ammunition cooking off, the column lost cohesion and became a clustered target rather than a mobile defense. Within 40 minutes, Ukrainian units radioed that more than 24 armored vehicles were disabled or destroyed. Local battlefield footage, smoke-screened through verified channels, later showed hulks of armor on fire, turret rings melted, and tracks sheared by precision munitions. The raw dollar figure that made headlines, $192 million, was less about cash on the ground and more about the replacement cost of the combined armor and support vehicles rendered inoperable that day, a calculation Ukraine's logistics teams refined using contemporary unit price guides and Western open-source valuations. It was a psychological blow, too, one that Russian officers could not minimize. Entire tactical formations reduced to immobile ruins by weapons costing a fraction of a single main battle tank's price. Analysts from several defense think tanks later noted the tactical pattern: use drones to herd, then ambush with loitering munitions, as a repeatable method that had slowed Russian mechanized thrusts across drone-dense sectors all year. The wider context made the ambush possible. Russia's air and missile campaign in late October 2025 launched thousands of expendable drones across Ukrainian skies in a bid to overwhelm defenses. Ukrainian forces reported stepping up domestic long-range strikes in response, hitting energy infrastructure and logistics nodes inside Russia, creating reciprocal pressure on Moscow's supply chains. Both sides were juggling hundreds of platforms nightly. The sheer churn of drones meant that tactical surprise could be regained by blending low-cost swarm tactics with hard intelligence. The Iron Wasp planners had watched that calculus, and they timed the trap for a logistical window when fuel resupply and maintenance stops forced the Russian column into an exposed posture. The aftermath played out like a case study. A single Ukrainian brigade repurposed commercial drones into battlefield sequencers. A remote unit of volunteers coded swarm heuristics that let the systems autonomously maintain position and shift targeting priorities when new threats appeared. And a handful of artillery spotter teams synchronized loitering munitions with artillery smoke to magnify confusion. The Russians lost not only vehicles, but time. Repair crews, recovery vehicles, and protective screens were siphoned off to salvage operations, thinning the front elsewhere. The human cost was real. Intercepted signals picked up PLEDAs and panicked shortwave traffic from tank crews calling for medevac and fuel convoys that never arrived. Yet in Kiev, the operation was framed as an evolution of warfare, the triumvirate of information, autonomy, and precision. A month later, intelligence assessments painted the strategic trace. Ukrainian strikes against Russian fuel and logistics hubs throughout the fall had forced Moscow to reroute supply chains through longer, more vulnerable corridors. That pressure increased the incidence of columns moving at night and consolidating into longer convoys that became, paradoxically, better targets for drone traps. Western analysis published in late October and early November noted this shift. Russia's logistic burden, once masked by depth, was now exposed to persistent, cheap aerial reconnaissance that could be matched by Ukraine's domestic drone production and tactical improvisation. The Iron Wasp ambush would be cited as emblematic of that trend, a relatively low-cost, high-impact knockout using assets that defense ministries had until recently labeled secondary. There were consequences beyond the battlefield. Within days of the ambush, battlefield insurance rates for contracted recovery crews surged in contested regions. Fuel pipelines were rerouted, increasing transit times by 18 to 27% in some sectors as commanders tried to avoid the kill boxes Ukraine was establishing. Russia responded by increasing electronic warfare patrols and deploying small drone killer teams, quadrotors outfitted with netting or interceptors, but those countermeasures were costly and slow to scale. Each defensive layer added weight and complexity to logistics, and each kilo added to the $192 million arithmetic, because the value of a column is far more than metal. It's fuel, ammunition, time, and the freedom to maneuver. In the quiet rooms where Ukraine's operations planners debriefed, they emphasized a lesson that would be taught widely in NATO workshops in the months that followed. Modern combined arms does not mean more tanks and more planes. It means integrating cheap, autonomous systems into lethal orchestration, using information and maneuver to turn an enemy's strengths into liabilities. The ambush on the H-20 highway was not an isolated miracle. It was the visible end of a season of adaptation that included long-range strikes, swarms, and a relentless campaign to make logistics itself the front line. If a single number had to be carved into the headlines, $192 million, it was only a ledger entry against a larger accounting: the rising cost of moving steel in an age of ubiquitous sensors. Finally, the human slice. At a field hospital 2 weeks later, a wounded Russian driver recounted how the first strike felt like a lightning strike under the hull, how the night turned to fire and noise, and how, in the confusion, a neighbor tank's turret erupted. Across the road, Ukrainian crews were reconstructing the kill box for training, their tactical diagrams now stamped into doctrine. The headline would read as theater: Ukraine drone trap and annihilate a $192 million Russian tank column. But the truth lived in smaller things. A young drone operator watching her screen for 12 hours straight. A logistics officer scheduling convoys at 0300 to avoid known patterns. The quiet satisfaction of engineers who repurposed parts scavenged from bazaars into lethal tools. Together they had made a new kind of battlefield, one where the defined front line dissolved into a net of sensors, and where a single, well-timed ambush could write an entire chapter in the evolving law of war.